She was returning home after a late training session at the local martial arts gym. The streets were nearly empty. Only the dim light from the street lamps reflected off the wet pavement. Suddenly, from a dark alley, she felt something in the air shift. She slowed her steps, listening carefully, but everything around her was silent. Not a sound. At that moment, a group of hooligans suddenly jumped out of the darkness. Their laughter was harsh and crude, and they surrounded her, leaving no chance for escape. One of the guys grabbed her arm, while another held her by the shoulder. She tried to break free, but their grip was strong and confident. "Where are you going?" one of them said with a smirk, watching her confusion. He didn't give her the slightest chance to push him away. Her heart tightened with fear, but she tried to stay calm, as her coach had taught her. She struggled to get free, but one of the guys suddenly yanked her hair and she screamed in pain. The hooligans began to laugh. They tormented her like a toy. But the leader didn't stop. He pulled out a knife and, without saying a word, quickly brought it to her hair. Mixed feelings of fear and pain overwhelmed her as she felt the cold blade cut a lock of her hair. "Serves you right," he said, holding her cut-off lock in his hand, while his friends continued laughing. The girl's heart raced with anger. This wasn't just humiliation, it was something more. Fury boiled inside her, and she felt herself losing control. But before she could do anything, the hooligans, smirking, threw her to the ground and quickly retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the night as if nothing had happened. She knelt there, her hair hanging unevenly, her chest heaving with rage. They had gone, but she knew this wasn't over. Jason walked into the gym, where the air was thick with the smell of sweat, rubber, and wood. The sounds of training filled the space, punches on bags, breathing, and the instructor's shouts. In the corner by the window, he spotted a familiar figure, Amanda. The girl had her head bowed, focused on working punches on the pads, but her movements showed signs of fatigue. He stepped closer, his voice soft so as not to startle her. "Hey, are you all right? You haven't been around for a while." Amanda barely lifted her eyes, her gaze heavy and filled with something Jason couldn't immediately understand. She replied quietly, "It was hard." In that moment, Jason realized that it was deeper than just missed training sessions. After the workout, Jason suggested they talk privately. They went to a small break room where the warm light from the lamp created a cozy atmosphere, almost as if protecting them from the cold world outside. Amanda told him everything, how one evening, while returning home, she was surrounded by a group of guys. They laughed, cut her hair, teased and humiliated her with words that hurt deeper than any physical blow. She described the details, the smell of rain on the asphalt, the cold wind, the feeling of loneliness in the middle of the crowd. Jason listened without interrupting, feeling his heart tighten from the pain she was sharing, a pain he couldn't fully feel but desperately wanted to ease. "Why them?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," she replied. "Maybe because of the color of my skin, or maybe just because I was different." In Amanda's eyes, something new flickered. Not fear, but a challenge. She didn't want to break, but her strength was running low. Jason saw her shoulders straighten slightly as she spoke about trying to return to training, to find herself again. "You're stronger than you think," he said, clenching his fist, "and you're not alone. I won't let them treat you like that." For the first time in a long while, she smiled. A shy smile, but a smile that was a sign of hope. After the conversation with Amanda, Jason felt a responsibility not just as a coach, but as someone who had to protect the weak. But how could he do that without making noise or causing unnecessary trouble? He understood that an open confrontation might only make things worse. Jason started small. He began to carefully watch the streets in the neighborhood. Every evening after his shift at the gym, he went on patrol through the dark alleys and abandoned courtyards, listening to the sounds that others preferred to ignore. He wasn't in a hurry. Every shadow, every suspicious sound caused tension. but he didn't allow himself to retreat. His eyes had become sharp, like a hunter tracking his prey. In the first few days, Jason learned the names and habits of those who tormented Amanda. They were young, from schoolboys to guys who had just graduated from college, but already had a bad reputation. Each one played a role. One teased, one distracted, one watched the victim's reaction. Jason began visiting the places where they gathered: a deserted garage, a small cafe on the corner, a sports field that, in the evenings, turned into their territory. He watched them talk, laugh, and sometimes glance toward the street, as if the sound of footsteps made them uneasy. After a week, Jason decided to take the first step. He met two of them at that very garage. There was no threat in his voice, just firmness and confidence. "I know who you are," he said. "What you did was wrong. It needs to stop." The guys exchanged skeptical looks, snorted, and said that he was making too much of a fuss over nothing. Jason didn't argue. His gaze grew colder. "This isn't nothing," he replied calmly. "I'm not joking." The guys walked away, laughing, but Jason felt he had planted a seed of doubt. Despite their clear disdain, Jason didn't lose his patience. He kept observing and taking notes. He saw that some of the bullies began to avoid the places where he might run into them. This gave him hope. He understood. Fear shouldn't be a tool for revenge, but rather a restraining force, making them think twice. With each passing day, the tension grew. The guys tried to figure out who was interfering in their business and began to look around cautiously. Jason knew that any sudden move could lead to the conflict he was trying to avoid. He kept his distance, using shadows and silence as his allies. Inside, he counted every step, every conversation, every second as precious. That evening, when Jason was once again observing their territory, he realized the time had come. He could no longer leave it for later, hoping that the bullies would stop on their own. He wasn't the kind of person who waited for a problem to solve itself. A confrontation was inevitable, but at the same time he did not want to become someone who used force without necessity. He understood that his actions could lead to consequences affecting not only himself, but also those he was trying to protect. That was why every decision was carefully considered, every movement deliberate. That evening, Jason spotted one of the main instigators. The guy stood by an old bench, talking to one of his friends. They were laughing, unaware of Jason's approach. Jason slowed his steps, trying not to draw attention, but his presence was undeniable. When the guy turned and saw him, his face went pale. He immediately realized this was not just a conversation, it was a warning. He remembered Jason, the same man who had confronted him before, and his eyes could not forget that look. "We get it," the guy said, his voice trembling with tension. "You're scaring us." Jason didn't reply right away. He stood silently, watching him closely. The person before him was half his age and physically much weaker. But in his eyes, Jason sensed something unspoken, fear mixed with the belief that it can't be that simple. Then Jason stepped closer, raising his chin slightly to show he wasn't backing down. "You're not afraid of me," Jason said. "You're afraid that the consequences of your actions will catch up to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. You know I'm not alone, and even if you don't fear me, I can make you understand what's happening and why." The guy clenched his fists and looked away, as if searching for an escape in the silent night. Finding none, he took a step back. Jason didn't continue the verbal exchange. He knew words were powerless here. Actions, that's what needed to be used. "You don't owe me anything," Jason said, pointing to the guy's companion standing nearby. "But your friends don't seem to be teaching you the important things." A few minutes passed, and Jason realized he couldn't complete his task without using force. He was prepared for this and knew how to do it without causing destruction in the process. Jason took a step forward. He didn't use cruelty, but was confident in his actions. His fingers gripped the guy's wrist, his body, as if anticipating the movement, already knew how to respond. Not everyone might see this as skill, but for Jason it was precision and calculation. He brought him down to the ground, controlling every movement without breaking his body. "I don't want to ruin your life," he said quietly, leaning in close to the guy's ear so he could feel his breath. "But if you keep doing what you're doing, everything that happens will be your responsibility." Jason released his grip and took a step back. He knew that the next morning would be a turning point for this guy and everyone with him. The next morning, Jason learned that one of the guys had disappeared. He hadn't shown up in his usual spots. Rumors started circulating in the neighborhood. Something happened to him. The guy disappeared. No one knew what had happened, but uneasy conversations started to pop up on the streets. This was what Jason wanted. He didn't aim to break anyone completely, but his actions made the guys start thinking about the consequences of their actions. The first successes filled Jason with confidence, but he also knew this victory wasn't over yet. The bullies began to band together, and Jason started preparing for the next step. He saw how this behavior was starting to take root in their hearts. He understood that fighting for justice required more than just punishment. It was a path to restoration. Over time, Jason realized that punishing the bullies was only part of solving the problem. He began looking for ways to change their internal perceptions. He started meeting with local activists, helping to create programs for teenagers that could steer them away from violence. It was a long road, but Jason knew he was directing his efforts in the right way. His actions not only changed the streets of the neighborhood, but also the lives of the people he met. And although at one point he could have become someone who simply destroyed others' lives, he chose a path that allowed him to change their fates without losing his humanity. Even though Jason saw how the situation was gradually changing, he still felt uncertainty inside. He wasn't the kind of person who was used to handling such problems. Every day he faced new challenges, and every time the same question arose in his mind. Am I doing the right thing? Sometimes at night, when he was coming home after a long day, it felt like he was walking on the edge, where every decision could lead to irreversible consequences. He saw how the bullies were changing. One by one, they began to avoid the places where they could be confronted. Some even tried to apologize, but Jason didn't believe in their sincerity. He knew that such behavior wouldn't just disappear. The internal conflict became his constant companion. On one hand, he wanted these people to understand the consequences of their actions, and he knew they needed to be held accountable. On the other hand, he wasn't ready to break them completely. Jason wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking justice, and that was far more complicated than simply punishing the guilty. He remembered how Amanda had turned to him with gratitude, but there was no fear in her eyes. She had started returning to the gym, gradually rebuilding her confidence. Jason saw how she held her head higher when she entered the training room. She was no longer the girl they had intimidated, and although her face still bore traces of fear, there was something new in her posture, something that filled her with strength. Days passed, and Jason began to notice that the inner conflict wasn't disappearing. Every new morning, he woke up with a heavy feeling in his chest. His thoughts returned again and again to those scenes when he had used force. He couldn't forget the guy who had been lying on the ground, his breathing fast and his eyes full of fear. He wasn't just experiencing this for others. He wondered if he had done the right thing, if he had let his emotions get the better of him. Maybe he could have handled it differently. Maybe there was another way. He often asked himself whether he could have found a less violent way to influence these people. But no matter what he thought, the reality remained unchanged. He had acted as he believed was necessary, but consequences would always follow. What would happen if the bullies sought revenge? What if they returned with even more fury? Jason frequently imagined the consequences. He knew that in a world where violence breeds violence, everything could come back around. And although he didn't seek revenge himself, he understood. The world around him wasn't that simple. In the following days, Jason continued working with Amanda. He helped her not only with her training, but with her personal struggles. He taught her not to be afraid of becoming stronger, and if she ever encountered those who had tried to humiliate her again, she would be ready, not only to protect herself, but also to ensure that no one could scare her again. Deep inside, Jason knew that this situation wouldn't end here. He had learned to see the world through the eyes of those he encountered. He had learned to understand that every action has a cause. And despite his own brutality, he kept moving forward, knowing that only this path could lead him to the answers he sought. Every day, Jason felt the pressure mounting. The bullies seemed to start realizing that he wouldn't stop until he had seen things through to the end. Gradually, with each new encounter, they became more aggressive. And then came the moment when Jason understood. He had to act decisively. That day felt just like any other. Training, evening, the cold air and the shadows slowly creeping over the city. Jason had been watching the streets for several days, knowing that they were planning something. He had seen one of the bullies meet with someone on a quiet street before heading toward the garages. Jason felt that this wasn't just a coincidence. Tonight, something was going to happen. He left his car aside and walked on foot, quietly, almost stealthily. His gaze was focused, every step deliberate. He didn't want to take risks, but he knew that if he continued intervening, he couldn't avoid an encounter with them. He was ready. The line had been crossed, and now there was only one thing left to do: face the consequences. The street was empty. Only the occasional car passed by, lighting up the bare walls of old buildings. Jason approached the corner where, according to his calculations, the bullies would appear. He knew their routes and habits. It was his strength, observation. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the guy Jason had met before appeared. He was alone, but not empty-handed. He was holding something that could barely be called a weapon. "You're here again, Jason," he said with a tired but confident voice. "You're one step ahead, as always. You think you can stop us?" Jason didn't rush to answer. He saw that the guy wasn't ready to resolve the conflict peacefully, and his gaze betrayed that. Jason knew, if he didn't show firmness now, the situation would spiral out of control. "I don't want to fight you," Jason said calmly, but with a steely resolve in his voice. "I want you to understand that you can't keep acting like this. You can stop. You can take control of your life." The guy looked at him as if trying to gauge how serious Jason was, but his gaze quickly turned ominous. "Your words are as empty as all the others," he replied, tightening his grip on the object in his hands, which now looked much more dangerous. The moment he tried to raise the weapon, Jason acted instantly. He lunged forward, dodging the strike and grabbing his wrist. This was the turning point. The guy, feeling Jason grip his arm, tried to throw him off, but he didn't have time. Jason's body reacted automatically. His movements were precise, fast, and left no room for mistakes. He wrenched the weapon from the bully's hands and tossed it aside. With the next motion, he pressed him against the wall, feeling the rising tension. "Don't you understand that you're wrong?" Jason said coldly, not knowing how else to explain his resolve. The guy fell silent, his breathing becoming more rapid. He hadn't expected to face such determination. "You're not alone," he said, trying to muster some strength. "But you've probably already realized that fighting us isn't so easy." Jason understood that this encounter was just part of the problem. The bullies had started to unite, and now he wasn't facing just a few individuals, but an entire gang. At that moment, when the tension peaked, someone unexpectedly appeared. It was another guy from the same gang, the one who had previously shown signs of doubt and guilt. He stood in the shadows, but his presence didn't go unnoticed. "Stop!" he shouted, taking a hesitant step toward Jason and his opponent. "You know this is pointless. We can't keep doing this." Jason felt the air in his chest lighten with those words. This person was the one who could change things. There was no fear in his eyes, but something else, an awareness that you could change your fate if you made the right choice. He turned to Jason and said, I can't be part of this anymore. We were wrong, and I understand that. But you have to leave him alone. None of us should be what the streets make us." The bully Jason had just confronted was still standing, trying to recover his strength. There was no fear in his eyes, but now they held something else: fatigue. Jason sensed that the situation was beginning to shift, but it wasn't over yet. He knew that the next move would be decisive. If he showed any weakness, everything would go off track. But if he stood firm, everything could change. He looked again at the guy he was in conflict with, signaling that the time for talking was over. "I'm not going to break you," he said firmly. "I'm giving you a chance. But if you take another step in that direction, we'll all suffer." The guy, realizing that Jason was right, finally understood. The fight wasn't always about physical confrontation. It was a test of spirit, willpower, and determination. As the guys dispersed, Jason felt the tension lift. But it wasn't just the end of the conflict. It was the first step toward changing not only their lives, but also their perception of the world around them. He knew that every action had consequences, and those consequences could either destroy or build something new. With this understanding, Jason walked toward the gym, where his students were waiting for him. Amanda was there, among the others, and he knew that she was no longer the person she used to be. Now she could face not only physical threats, but also her internal fears. His work wasn't finished, but that day marked an important milestone in their shared journey toward a better future. With each passing day, Jason became more convinced that the bullies were changing their attitude. With every new step, he saw their confidence crumble, and though he couldn't claim that they would immediately become better, he felt that the changes were starting with them. Amanda had become a true symbol for others. She began attending the gym again, with her head held high. Each training session was not just a step forward for her, but a confirmation that she couldn't be broken. She was learning not only physical strength, but also inner resilience. Yet, at the same time, within Jason, unease lingered. Despite the victories, he couldn't forget that one guy who still occupied his thoughts. What would become of him? How would this struggle end? He knew that a decisive step was unavoidable. And although he hoped everything would change peacefully, he understood that the next stage might require even more effort. One evening, Jason again heard the familiar footsteps, and his intuition told him that one of the former bullies was trying to meet him again. He wasn't wrong. Right in front of the gym, he noticed the same guy he had faced several times before. "Jason," the guy said, stopping in front of him, "you probably didn't expect to see me, but I needed to talk." The guy's voice was tense, but not threatening. Jason looked at him closely, trying to understand what he wanted to say. "What do you want to talk about?" he asked, not hiding his wariness. The guy hesitated for a moment, but then continued, slowly revealing himself with each word. I can't be part of this anymore. Everything we did, I can't justify it anymore. I realized that we were the ones destroying, not building. I want you to know that I'm changing. I don't know where this will go, but I've decided to start." Seeing the sincerity in the guy's eyes, Jason felt a sense of relief. He knew it wasn't the end, but it was the first real step that could change a lot. "All right," Jason said, nodding. "We can all change. You're on the right path. But remember, it won't be easy. Be ready for challenges. Change takes time." The guy nodded, then, without saying another word, turned and walked away. Jason stood at the entrance of the gym, feeling that this moment was far more significant than all the struggles with physical threats. The next morning, Jason arrived at the gym earlier than everyone else to reflect and think about what had happened. He remembered how his journey had started. At first, he just wanted to protect the girl, then to change the situation. And now he realized that changing other people was much more complicated than he had expected. He couldn't just break people. He had to help them see the light, even if it was the darkest path. Meanwhile, Amanda trained with a new energy. Jason noticed how she seemed more confident. her movements becoming more fluid, and her gaze firm and focused. She was ready for any challenge, but the biggest challenge was yet to come. Late one evening, Jason returned home, took off his jacket, and sat on the edge of his bed. He looked at his coach's jacket and thought about the journey he had gone through. Everything that had happened was tied to one determination: the desire to change someone's life. He reflected on the fact that every day we face difficulties, but what is even harder is learning how to overcome them. Where he was now wasn't the final destination, but it had become an important milestone in his life. And in that moment, when his phone rang, he felt everything was changing. It was a call from the same guy he had spoken to just a few hours ago. He asked, "Jason, do you believe that everything we did means something?" Jason smiled, realizing that this wasn't just a question, but an acknowledgement. "Yes, I believe. You believe it too, and that's what matters." That day, Jason understood that everything he had done had led to an important outcome. The changes didn't start with his actions, but with the internal realization of each person. He couldn't be with everyone all the time, but he could plant a seed that would eventually bear fruit. His entire journey wasn't about punishing, but about showing that every action has a cost, and that violence breeds violence. Now, when everything seemed to be complete, he knew this was only the first step. He would continue working with people, helping them change, teaching them that the real battle in life is the one within. As Jason watched Amanda standing in the gym with the other students, he realized that his task was complete, but the path to true healing was only just beginning. And in this lay the true strength of his work, not just in physically overcoming obstacles, but in the inner transformation of people.